Welcome back to Kevin Makes Cool Things. I'm Kevin, and today I am making a Funko Pop style figurine of Esil from the Solo Leveling webtoon. This is part of a challenge I set for myself to make Funko Pop style figurines of different characters from the series. Last month, I did Sung Jin-woo, the main character. This month, I plan to do both Esil and Jae-hee, who are two of the main female characters, but you'll see that things didn't go exactly as planned. I decided to make Esil in her black dress. We never see a full body shot of this, but I don't have the skill to do her armor, and this seemed cuter. After a lot of thought, I decided to put Esil in a pouting pose like this. She doesn't do this specifically in the webtoon, but it does fit with her character. After deciding what I was doing for the project, I started by doing some modeling work off camera. Funko Pops don't have a lot of detail, which is part of their charm, but also a real challenge when you're designing them. I needed to make sure that Esil's body was distinctly feminine, without being so over-exaggerated that it was weird or creepy. I spent about an hour working on this, and then ended up calling my wife in for a second opinion. Once I was confident that I had something in the right ballpark, and could fine-tune this later, I went back and did my normal process, starting with references, and then moving into more detailed work in Blender. As I moved into GIMP, I started with a screenshot of the updated figure. The arms are still in the same position as last time, but I did update the body and the eyes. I also added some references along the sides. I wanted to have access to these before I started sketching, but they'll also be handy when I'm in Blender, so I can evaluate how I'm doing. I sketched over this and added the rough details, which included some custom ears. The biggest issue was her hair. I felt pretty confident going into this project, but I was quickly humbled. Her hair has these chisel-like bangs, which is not an uncommon style in webtoons, but is surprisingly difficult to 3D model. I tried modeling these with cubes, building them directly with a mesh, and using the same curves approach I used last month. I went back and forth on this at least a dozen times. I'd spend an hour working on one approach, second-guess everything, and then either start over with something else or switch back to a previous attempt. Eventually, I decided to use the same curves approach that I used on my Sung Jin-woo Funko Pop. This wasn't perfect, but creating this effect out of different strands gave me the best results of the different approaches I tried. I took a break from the hair to work on the arms. I quickly realized that a key part of this pouting position is the mouth, and without it, this just looks kinda weird. I switched to having her arms at her side, which gives a similar vibe. I used this Bulma figure as a reference, which worked really well. As I was trying to wrap up the hair, I got really annoyed with how sharp the edges were. This is a minor detail, but after all the time and effort I put into this, it really bugged me. To fix this, I had to change the preview resolution for the hair, and then convert it to a mesh. Then I had to remove the bottom cap, which isn't actually part of this, and repair the mesh. Afterwards, I adjusted these points just to round the edges a little bit, and applied a subdivision surface modifier. I don't do a lot of drawing, but I do enough to know that hands are really hard to sketch. Turns out, it's even more difficult to sculpt them. I found a reference on Thingiverse which helped with this, but it still took me several attempts to make a halfway decent fist. I ended up walking away a few different times out of frustration, and coming back the next day once I cooled off. For printing, I divided this into two pieces. Last month, I accidentally broke my Funko Pop around this area, and it worked out for the best because I had more access to the underside of the head and the shoulders, and was able to do a better job finishing it. This time, I divided it this way intentionally, and it worked out well. When I printed this, I realized how small I'd made the body. I wanted to make it slightly smaller than my Sung Jin-woo Funko Pop so it appeared more feminine, but this was too much. I ended up scaling the body up a little and increasing the size of the hands and feet by about 25% before reprinting. I did a rough round of sanding with my Dremel tool, then applied a thin layer of wood filler. I diluted this with a little bit of water to get it thinner than normal. I'm still trying to find the best approach for finishing these prints, and I'm not sure this is it, but I'm glad I tried it. You can also notice that one of the hands is missing. That broke off while I was peeling the supports, which was totally my bad. I glued it back on a little while later. After a few rounds of wood filler, sanding, and spray-on primer, I decided it was time to attach the pieces together. I did this with 2-part epoxy, and used a little bit of nail in some 2mm holes to make sure the pieces were aligned. After this dried, I filled the gap with wood filler. This didn't quite stand up on its own, but it was only about a ½ millimeter off. I added a dot of superglue to both feet to try to fix this. UV resin would have been a better option, but I didn't have any handy. This ended up being a little too thick, so I shaved it down with a chisel and eventually got it to balance. I started the painting step by applying the skin tone. At this point, I thought it was going to be smooth sailing. And then I dropped this on the floor and snapped off an arm and a foot. This was a weird shape and it just slipped out of my hands while I was working on it. After a little bit of cursing, I glued the pieces back together and continued painting. The rest went fairly smoothly. Despite my best efforts, I did have to go back and touch up the skin at the end, but it was pretty minor. After painting, I finished this off with a spray coat of matte sealer, and it was done. Seeing these two together gets me really excited about growing this collection. Overall, this was a stressful but satisfying project. I started this Funko Pop challenge to push my limits, and for better or worse, this project gave me exactly what I asked for. Aside from the modeling, which was the main focus of this video, there are a couple of other things I wish I'd done differently. Top of that list, I really wish I hadn't dropped and broken this. It went back together pretty cleanly, but it still feels really bad. Also, as I'm making this video, and looking back at all the original reference images, I wish I'd gone for a slightly different color for her hair. It looked fine when I was doing the painting, but looking back, I should have gone for a lighter shade. I'll be making Chaihin next month, and hopefully I can take all these lessons and do better next time. If you want to make your own Esil figurine, I'll post all these files on Thingiverse. There'll be a link in the video description. If you like this video and want to support the channel, then please go ahead and leave a like, a comment, or subscribe. Until next month.